Welcome, everyone. My name is Shahar Sadeh. It is my esteemed pleasure as a director of the Resilient Cities program and the faculty engagement program at the JCRC of New York to open this exciting event today and host two wonderful speakers, Hilay Selivansky and John Paul Farmer, the CTOs of Tel Aviv and New York City, for a conversation about civic engagement, technology, and resilient cities. Resilient cities are defined as cities that have the ability to absorb, recover, and prepare for future shocks, economic, environmental, social, and institutional, to promote sustainable development, well-being, and inclusive growth. For the last 4 decades, the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, as a local organization, has been working to create and solidify relations between New York City and Israel, but more importantly, it has been working to promote social and communal resilience in New York. It has incubating initiatives to create leadership networks for solving common problems, has sustained diverse network, has empowered and has been empowered by the diverse communities of this city. And finally, it served as a focal point for community actions in times of crisis. As we all know, building urban resilience requires a holistic look at the city, understanding the system that make up the city and the interdependencies and risks they may face. Cities have always served as catalysts for innovations and are at the forefront of addressing our time's urgent challenges. The new normal of 2020 brought about by COVID-19 forced cities, as well as other major organizations, to think and rethink their operations. This is one of the reasons that we, as a locally based organization, are launching the Resilient Cities program today with a great admiration to our local government experts and an even greater will to enhance our engagement with them. And what better way to open 2021 than discussing civic engagement and technology? I doubt that a year ago, this would be the topic I would choose to open a program such as this one, but today it's undeniably an essential building block when it comes to civic engagement. The session today will explore the role of technology in engaging residents, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. How did the pandemic accelerate the technological shifts of municipalities? Were municipalities able to improve services? Did they exacerbate inequity or proactively close gaps and enhance equity, and much more? No less important, the session gives a comparative view of two amazing global cities, Tel Aviv and New York City, personally my two favorites, two cities that never sleep, but were forced to some extent to pause, as did the rest of the world. There are many reasons to team Tel Aviv and New York City for a joint learning process. Global cities located at the beachfronts, smart, diverse, technologically driven, with a dynamic high-tech community, inclusive, and much more. Both cities have done and are still doing tremendous and most creative work in engaging the residents throughout the pandemic. And this is why we have gathered here today. With that, I want to quickly introduce our speakers. You have their bios in the invitation. Hilay Selivansky is the CTO of Tel Aviv municipality and has over 35 years of technology and business experience in Israel and globally. John Paul Farmer is the CTO of the City of New York and an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. The program will go as follows. Each of the speakers will give a presentation for about 12 to 30 minutes. Then they will challenge each other with some questions, and we'll open the floor to Q&A from the audience. If you want to ask a question, please drop it in the chat and send those to me. With that, Hilay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shahar. I will share my presentation. So, hi all, hi Shahar, hi John Paul, and everyone. What Tel Aviv municipality did during the COVID-19 era? So this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to be on the beach or on the surfboard and enjoy life, but it's not the case. The COVID-19 got us through hard time, but there is a light in the end of the tunnel. The percentage of vaccinated in Israel today is 24%. It's almost 1 in every 4 people. The percentage of vaccinated in the older population is 63%, almost 2 out of 3. The situation in the world is a little bit different. The percentage of vaccinated in the world is about 0.4%, 4 per mile. In the States, it's around 3%. Tel Aviv and Israel know how to act quickly in the time of crisis. Perform what is required, even if it does not always work out according to the plan, but always getting the job done, because this is the case we are looking at. Technology is an enabler. It makes it possible to solve problems. In this time of crisis, as we experience it now and all over the world, technology and innovation are the way to reach and solve a problem. This always challenges us to the way we are managed, the way the executive management of the municipality works. They're willing to do things that weren't done before. And in this crisis, it was reflected even more. So I'm a CTO, technology is not important. The important thing is the residents and what's important to them. What they seek us to do. This is the challenge. Technology is only the tool. So what we did so far in the beginning of the crisis. First, we made sure that even if we are in lockdown and closure, all municipality employees could work remotely. Our employees can also be harmed by the working together in the office. So we need to keep them alive and healthy. We have enabled in absolute number more than half of the municipality workers to work remotely as required by increasing infrastructure, distributing laptop, and providing training. What about the other half? The other half, it's simply impossible. City hazard cannot be treated through a computer. It's not possible to click the road or clean the sidewalk from this distance. Also, we needed to provide our residents a way to speak with us and not go to our office physically. Internet and telephone is good, but we need to change the way we are thinking. That required us to establish new call centers, a contact center, to be able to approach residents and be able to residents to approach us. But how we can do that? Workers had worked from home need to get the right equipment, communication line, reroute our voice calls, and of course, be able to use all the IT system to do their duties. So we did it. We made the new contact centers, We got more than 200 representatives be able to work at home, and it's working right now. Of course, in a crisis, the regular work never stops. We had to find a way to get a meeting going and be able to keep on using our organizational culture. If at past time, VC, virtual conference call, was a nice to have, it now became an essence. And we need to find out immediate solution. We chose a product. We sought all the users from the CEO and the executive management to the last of the employees, how to use the service. Distributed camera and headphones and made sure that not everyone know how to use it. We will do and teach them over and over and over. And we know that some people have a phobia from technology, so we made sure that they are not afraid of using the technology that we gave them. It was also an opportunity to expand the management tools we already gave the managers with additional information regarding the COVID-19. For example, you see here, we made a dashboard, a real-time dashboard with the information needed by the manager or executive. We created the dashboard for each vertical silo of information or operation according to the topics that the manager wanted to see. If he didn't want to see the information, we put it away. If he needed information that was on other IT system, we found out how to do that. The information, for example, in this case, was on a GIS map with some dashboard and statistical information. But let me take you to the end. At the beginning of my presentation, I started with numbers about the vaccination. The municipality decided to help the government and the HMOs in Israel and establish a vaccination complex. All this in a very short period of time, few days, together with, of course, the municipality hospital. The manager and the executive of the municipality all pushed in order to build this complex. And now it's able to vaccinate thousands of people every day. Oh, sorry. Also, in this era, civil responsibility is important. It's important to the municipality and it's important to our residents. We began distributing food and other products to those that couldn't afford it or not be able to go outside. Many of our municipal employees participated with their private vehicles and as well as civilians that asked to join in and help others that couldn't get those things. This, for example, is only in one day to see how people gather around in order to take the products and getting them into other people. We call it Meals on Wheels. We also didn't forget our senior citizens. Making sure that senior citizens keep in touch with their family and with their friends is important to us. For those who didn't have a computer or a smartphone, and there are a lot of people like that, we distributed a tablet, including central contact paid by the Tel Aviv municipality, and very easy to use application to perform basic operations, such as video calling, setting photos, and receiving messages. We gathered around volunteers who wanted to help. We taught them how to use the application and the tablet, and then they went to the senior citizens and help them to use it once, and were the phone call or the first line of support for those senior citizens. This project is very successful, and we're about to expand it very soon to many more people, not only senior citizens. We should remember in the time of crisis that we are not alone in the world. There are other cities, and cooperation with them and sharing knowledge and information is important things in a crisis. We participated in a cross-country virtual discussion aimed at obtaining idea, way of implementation, and told others what is working and what is not working, and got information from them also. This was a very successful in the beginning of the crisis because others understood what is working or not. Israel is known as the startup nation, and Tel Aviv as a startup city. The place there are most startup per capita in the world. So of course, we reach them. We held a virtual hackathon aimed in finding solution to the problems we are facing. How to keep residents safe, how to make sure business can run, how to make sure restaurants keep working, even if the physical doors are closed. How to enable residents to help other residents. The goal was very specific. Finding problems we got from our residents, from local businesses, and give them solution. But now, in a very short period, not in a 1 year or so. I will end by saying that Tel Aviv as a city, to be specific, a smart city, based on two principles: proactivity and providing a good service to our residents. Technology only makes it possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilay. John, you're next. So.
Well, thanks everybody. Thank you to JCRC for bringing us together today, and to Shahar for moderating, and Hilay, great to hear about the progress that's being made in Tel Aviv. Certainly, Tel Aviv is known worldwide as a very innovative city, and one that's forward-leaning in the use of technology and the presence of tech expertise. So it's great to see the latest, to understand the latest. I'm going to walk you through some of the things that have happened recently in New York City, and it really boils down to the fact that collaboration is our superpower. That's not something that's new. People have been recognizing that for a long, long time. That's what human beings do especially well. We work well together. That's how we can solve problems. And that's really why cities work so well. Ed Glazer wrote a book called The Triumph of the City, and in it he called cities our greatest invention. And it's because they enable so much collaboration and so much progress to be made. We have to recognize that the last year has been a big challenge for cities, and New York City certainly one of them, being hit especially hard during the early days of the pandemic back in March and April of last year. Really tough times for New York City. I'll walk you through those times and then what we've done since. We'll talk about rapid response in the immediate early days of the pandemic, our focus on user experience and new technologies like contact tracing. And finally, I'll talk about the importance of broadband and why we developed a New York City Internet Master Plan. So if we transport ourselves back to late February, early March, we realized that we needed to ensure that people could get information, that people could understand what was happening. They could understand certainly what the coronavirus itself was, the practices that they should adopt to stay healthy. But then we also needed to do things like ensure that people could get access to information about school closures or changes to which side of the street you could park on a certain day because of street cleaning. We needed to make sure people could get the resources they needed, and they needed to have a front door for that. So we put banners on every government website. It's actually something that hadn't been done before, but we very quickly built this functionality so that no matter where you went in the New York City government web ecosystem, you were never more than a click away from information about the pandemic and the health crisis. And then we started building out day by day that information base and making sure that it was updated with the latest guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and other health experts, as well as our own Department of Health here in New York City. So informing the public was the absolute first thing we had to do to make sure that everyone was operating from the same set of facts and making good choices. We then moved on to how we could do our response better. And ultimately, we needed to be data informed. So one example of being data informed was on the PPE, personal protective equipment front. Folks may have seen some of the reports back in the spring about shortages of masks and other kinds of personal protective equipment, things like gowns and gloves. And those were very real. And they weren't just happening here in New York. There were global shortages because the supply chain wasn't set up to respond to a crisis like this. And New York City, along with others, was really scrambling to find what it needed to make sure that its healthcare workers were well equipped. And that meant that we needed to track production, things that were suddenly being manufactured in New York City, things like plexiglass shields for healthcare workers or someone working on the front lines. We needed to make sure that we were tracking procurements, purchases of masks, N95 masks, for example. And we need to make sure that we were tracking donations, because a number of people stepped up and out of the goodness of their heart started donating anything from small quantities to very large quantities of PPE. And to track that across the dozens of different agencies that were involved, just, again, something that hadn't ever been done before. So very quickly, with the help of our office, working closely with these agencies and bringing in some really talented volunteer technologists who just wanted to do the right thing and help in a moment of crisis, we were able to stand up a tracking system that could both track what was happening in closer to real time, but also project and estimate based on some simple machine learning what we were likely to face in the weeks and months ahead, and to ensure that we were on track and making sure that people had what they needed. The other piece of this was that we stood up a COVID-19 data task force to develop the strategy to understand the ways in which data could help us make better decisions. One example of this is working with Harvard University and Facebook to look at de-identified, so not violating anyone's privacy, making sure that we very much protected people's digital rights, but looking at aggregate Facebook mobility data in certain communities to understand if there were certain parts of New York City where people were not staying at home, and that was a really important thing to do to stop the spread. And knowing that if it was in a certain neighborhood, New York City is a place where over 800 languages are spoken. We've got an immigrant community of over 3 million people in our city. And so to ensure that we were communicating in a way that was being received and understood by each community, this mobility data was very useful in helping us do that. So the other piece of it is, it's not just about the data, and it's not just about putting up websites, it's about understanding the users and understanding people's needs and how they're going to respond and really adopt the recommendations that you're making. One place that we did this was on isolation hotels. Isolation hotels are what they sound like. It's a place, often an actual hotel, that was being repurposed as a place for someone who was sick, but not to the extent they need to go to a hospital, but just wanted to isolate, make sure they didn't expose any family members to the coronavirus, or maybe a healthcare worker who, again, didn't want to expose family to any potential risk. So they could go into these isolation hotels that the city made available, but that was an option. It wasn't anything that was being forced upon anybody. This was an option that was being presented. So we had to understand people, and we created user personas like the one that you see on the screen right now to understand the types of challenges, the types of suspicions, perhaps, that people might have of this new opportunity to use an isolation hotel, and not knowing what the experience would be like, not knowing whether they actually wanted to choose to do that or not. And so a persona like BU Yang you see here. We then dove in even deeper and looked at not just that person, but then what would that person's journey be? What would their user journey be along the entire process, from learning about an isolation hotel to signing up to checking in to being there for a number of days on end, being able to communicate with family and friends, having health checkups while in an isolation hotel, really diving in to get insights. And insights looked like this. One of the really simple ones, pretty straightforward, but important: put smokers on lower floors. Smoking is not allowed in these buildings. In many cases, it is not. In some cases, the windows don't open. People who smoke are probably going to smoke. And so if you put them on the 36th floor, they're going to have to take elevators up and down every day. Not exactly something we wanted to encourage during the pandemic. So put them on lower floors so that they can walk outside and have a smoke break and then come back while exposing as few people as possible to any risk of infection. So simple insights coming from really diving into the user experience. On the other end of the spectrum, we had new technologies being discussed and contact tracing apps being one of them. We actually started pivoting the way we talk about this from contact tracing apps to exposure notification apps, because ultimately contact tracing is a practice that a lot of people do really well and have done really well. Health departments have been doing this for years. Now it's being done at a scale that is bigger than anything that we can remember. And there is potential here for technology to help. And so as we look at exposure notification applications, we recognize that once again, they're only as good as their use. So when they are used, they're very helpful. If they are not used, if they're not trusted, then they don't really have the impact. So building trust in the technology, ensuring that people understood there were standards. And this is where working with the private sector, with companies like Google and Apple, who worked to ensure that their platforms, which are obviously very common from iOS to Android, their platforms enabled exposure notification applications to be built in such a way that protected privacy and digital rights was really important. And this question of digital rights really comes to the fore, because New York City, in collaboration with Barcelona and Amsterdam, a couple of years ago, created the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights. The website is citiesfordigitalrights.org. And this is now over 50 cities worldwide that have signed on because they believe in the importance of protecting privacy, of ensuring equity, of making sure that cybersecurity is a priority. All the things that matter today in an age in which we are living our lives more and more online, we need to make sure that people's rights are protected in this new day and age. So that brings me to the really underlying point here, which is that these new tools that we're so excited about, these new ways of understanding people and their experiences, so many of these rely on people being connected in the first place, people having broadband internet to ensure that they can thrive. That was important before the pandemic. And we actually released the New York City Internet Master Plan 1 year ago in January of 2020. Within just a couple of months, it took on a whole new level of importance and urgency. And we've seen the digital transformation of society pulled forward perhaps a decade. 10 years of change happened in the past year. Hilay talked about the adoption of video conferencing and the way people are working remotely and from home. That was a trend that was happening, but we all had to adopt it so quickly and learn it so quickly. And the reality is a number of people are not going to go back to the way they worked before. And so we need to make sure that everybody can participate in this digital economy that we now have and that nobody's left behind. And it relies on this simple understanding that broadband is as essential to 21st century New York as electricity or the subway were in the 20th century. Over recent decades, decisions have been made that have created digital redlining. And the mortgage industry for years intentionally chose not to serve people who were Black and brown, people who were lower income. We're seeing the same kinds of impacts now in broadband, where infrastructure is built in the wealthiest parts of the city, but not in others. And that means that the actual cost to provide service ends up being higher in the places that need it most and can afford high prices the least. So New York City has chosen through the Internet Master Plan to make a much more active role than ever before. First phase was immediate response to the pandemic, making sure that school kids, over 300,000 school kids, had internet connected devices, but also making sure that seniors, as Tel Aviv did, were connected, focusing on older adults living in public housing. In NYC, New York City Housing Authority, we went to 288 communities and were able to deliver over 10,000 devices to seniors, either living alone or only with other seniors. And really importantly, we also provided support. We worked with a local nonprofit to ensure that these internet connected devices didn't just sit there, but that every single recipient received outreach and coaching on how to use them, coaching on how to use them for email or to reach healthcare or exercise classes, or just to connect with family and friends. And there are some quotes that we heard from recipients that are really, they stick with you. And one of them was something along the lines of, I didn't realize how lonely I was until I got the tablet. And now I'm able to regularly communicate with my family, and I understand how important it is to me to know that they're okay and for them to know that I'm okay. That's the kind of impact that connection brings. But we didn't stop there. We realized that we needed to transform the marketplace, and we have a lot of assets in the city. Buildings. I mentioned 288 public housing developments. Well, there are over 300 of them in total. So we worked with NYCHA to use these buildings, the rooftops, the rooms in buildings, to ask the private sector, startups, large companies, even community groups, how would you use these assets if we could license them to you? How would you use these to provide low-cost internet service between $0 and $20 a month? Really bringing down that cost barrier so that more people could adopt high-speed internet. And this work yielded minority and women-owned business finalists. We got 3 times the number of responses we were expecting. And the focus on rapidly deploying in 2021 is really critical. This really also proved out the case that there was a lot of interest in the private sector, in partnering with government, and in using assets that government could bring to the table in a way that didn't just perpetuate the existing state of the broadband market, but changed it for the better, made it more affordable to more people. And so last year in 2020, the mayor got up and said something really groundbreaking, that New York City is investing $157 million. $157 million is the largest municipal investment in US history in closing the digital divide and coordinating the availability of city assets across 17 different government agencies. This is what will create change at scale. And people who read the plan have called it fantastic, a game changer, the most thoughtful and comprehensive blueprint by any major city. I will say for our friends in Tel Aviv, they were talking about US cities, so there's no comparison there. And these are just a few of the things that we're doing here in New York City, that we've done in New York City, but they show the importance of bringing technology to the table to meet the needs of real people in a moment of crisis. And I think that what we've done has helped people, but has also shown a blueprint for the role that technology innovation can play in a major municipality and helping change people's lives. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John, so much. This was fascinating. Thank you both. I'll open the floor to you, first of all, to you two. Hilay, if you want to go first, ask John questions, and John, you can ask afterward.
Yeah, I would like to ask John, if it's possible, did IoT help you in any way through this crisis? And if so, how?
That's a great question. So the Internet of Things, IoT, connected devices and systems, is something that's a big focus. We started a Smart Cities and IoT lab within the mayor's office of the CTO in New York. And we are on the verge of making some new announcements on that front very shortly. What I can talk about is how important it's been throughout 2020, even before the pandemic, when we were looking at air quality, for instance. So very much to the point of health. How do we promote health? How do we reduce asthma? Understanding air quality in a much more granular way than we've been able to do through static sensing. Instead, we put sensors onto fleet vehicles, the vehicles that are owned by New York City government that drive around the city every single day. We put air quality sensors on them. We were able to collect something around 100,000 data points in just weeks. That compares to maybe a couple of dozen data points that would be used normally. So being able to map out block by block the air quality so that we can respond better to take action to ensure that we are promoting good health. That's an example of how in 2020 we've used IoT, but we've also been looking at things like flood monitoring. And some of this has been in collaboration with Empire State Development by a state agency that's looking to fund better uses of the Internet of Things, of IoT, and certainly looking at what is happening in other countries. Israel being a good example of places that have really led the way with the way connected devices can improve city life.
Thank you.
So I think it's my turn now. I want to ask you actually about cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is something that I think is front of mind for so many of us. And as we are all more digital, you mentioned how Tel Aviv government is working remotely, more digital than ever before. How are you thinking about cybersecurity? Are there any specific actions that Tel Aviv has taken on that front?
Yeah. Thank you. So first of all, the cybersecurity in Israel is very important on the government level, and they even made a government unit doing and protecting businesses, government, organization, and everyone that need help in a crisis. So this is on the government level. But on our end, we first, on the COVID, we saw that there are a lot of attacks from outside. So we decided that we will close most of our websites and other internet providing services to outside world, getting only a request from Israel, except, of course, the site in English. This we kept open. So this is the first thing that did. The other thing is to lecture and tell everyone, be careful. Cybercrime is out there. Be careful. See that you are not going to site that are not as appeared with what they should be, and be careful clicking on emails and so on. And the last thing we did, we try to see if someone is attacking us. The way that we do it, we get some other good hackers, let's say, and tell them, okay, try and get into our systems. And we saw problems and we fixed them, but it's the most important thing that we're doing today.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I'm a big fan of bug bounties and red teaming, all of that. I want to point out that there's something that was a collaboration between New York City and some peers in Israel, and that was a cybersecurity for small business moonshot that we recently ran. So to step back, New York City, I think, made a really good choice by standing up a unit to focus on cybersecurity in recent years, and they're led by a colleague of mine named Jeff Brown, who does a fantastic job with NYC Cyber Command. And working with NYC Cyber Command, my office, and also with folks like Jerusalem Venture Partners, an Israeli venture capital firm, we launched this initiative because there are over 200,000 small businesses in New York City. And in most cases, they've only got 5, 8, 10 employees. They don't have IT and certainly not cybersecurity expertise. And so we were looking at how to help them. And so we challenged the private sector to come to us with solutions. And Jerusalem Venture Partners played a major role in that. We ended up getting a lot of ideas coming from Israel, as well as from New York City, and actually from 18 different countries on 5 different continents. So really a global challenge. And I think that's a really important thing that we did, because it gave us tools that were then ready and had been identified for when COVID hit and when work from home became much more common, and just when a lot of business went online, businesses that had previously been done in person. So cybersecurity is something that I think we've all been focusing on, and we will be focusing on for a very long time to come.
Thank you.
Okay. So the first question that we have will go to Hilay. If you can elaborate a bit about the way you were connecting in regard to vaccination, but not only about the vaccination, with foreign workers, refugees, that residents of Tel Aviv, and the non-Hebrew speaking community.
So resident of Tel Aviv, registered or not, is a resident, and we need to help them. And there are a few units in the municipality that help refugees and people that came to Israel running away from their country because of wars and so on. And we need to help them. And we must help them in any situation. COVID-19 even more, because they don't speak the language, they don't understand sometimes what is happening, because they don't get the news like every other residents and so on. So we need to make sure that we give them the information in their languages and make sure that they understand what they need to do. I don't know what the government is going to do about vaccination them, but I think in the end, they all will be vaccinated if they want, of course.
And you're in touch with them through technology or through different centers in the city?
It's more a person-to-person connection, because some of them are not even aware that they can reach us through the internet and so on.
Okay. Next question to John Paul. If you think about urban planning, aside from spreading out the Wi-Fi in public spaces, what is the next big thing technologically to support and fortify the social resilience and better communal affairs in New York City?
That's a really good question. The broadband work will be going on for a while, because it's not just about 4G that we have today, it's also about 5G and making sure that that is rolled out equitably. So that work's going to continue to be important for a long time to come. But the impact, the return on investment is so high that it's absolutely worth doing, even beyond the moral imperative, which is very much there. It's just a smart thing to do for New York City and every other city too. When you look at what else is going to be especially impactful, I would say Internet of Things and artificial intelligence are two issues that are going to have a big impact. New York City and probably Tel Aviv too, as centers for innovation, for startups, for small businesses that are growing fast and are experimenting with these new technologies and figuring out how they can solve real problems and find their niche in the business community. I think that's going to be really important. Something that I'm very passionate about, and I think is not a business, but is going to be hugely important, is cultivating a sense of civic duty among technologists. One of the things that we saw during the course of 2020 was an incredible number of people who might be data scientists or web developers stand up and say, I can help. And these are folks who generally have just worked in the private sector. They haven't really been government folks. They haven't been in the public sector, but they just wanted to help because they saw how much that was needed. And they saw how rare their skill sets are in some key agencies. There's an organization that was stood up in the United States called US Digital Response. And last I checked, they had a network they'd created of, I think, 7,000 different technologists across the country, and they were pairing them up with cities in need. And that's the kind of thing that was born out of this pandemic. And I hope that a silver lining we end up looking back on is that continues. That sense of engagement and civic duty continues amongst the tech sector.
Okay, good. So we have a few questions related to inequalities and health disparities in the COVID-19 response. So if you can, both of you, what happened here? If both of you can relate to that, or what is the biggest tech-related lesson you've gained from COVID-19 when it comes to health disparities and inequality?
I'll chime in first if that's okay. We just announced 2 days ago the winners, the outcome of our NYCX collab for accessible mental health for youth. And this is something that we were thinking about prior to COVID, but really took on a whole new meaning and a whole new level of urgency when suddenly families were working together, living together 24 hours a day, going to school in the same place. Some being impacted by the health impacts of COVID directly, others the fear of what that might mean to their family. And so the need for accessible mental health solutions really took off. And that's something that we're very proud of. 2 winners. If you want to go to nyc.gov/CTO, you can check them out. Me, myself, and I, and Next Step Health. One is very much a mobile technology, pretty straightforward, very user-centered. The other one is a really interesting approach to using comics and storytelling to help change the dynamic and change the cultural acceptance and get youth, particularly, engaging in taking care of their own mental health at a time when it's especially important. So that's one example from New York City that's especially timely and especially relevant.
Hilay?
Yeah, what I learned in this COVID-19 era is that the time frame or time to market, we need to get the solution out, because we usually get projects for months or so, for a few months. And now we needed to answer in a few days and even hours. because if something is wrong, we need to deal with it right now and not wait a month or so until we get the answer. And it was done all around on the things that matters to our residents and to the executives level in the municipality.
Okay, great. We have a few questions or remarks about collaboration between the two cities, adopting or learning from each other more thoroughly, not just through this session, about technologies that you've been used, and if you see a way to institutionalize the sharing of experience and best practices. Or are you, I know both are participating in global institutions that are supporting resilient cities and sustainable cities and global cities, but do you think or perceive any direct mechanism to enhance this type of collaboration?
I think cities are not really collaborating with each other because the data is very specific. None of the cities that I know is even similar to Tel Aviv. The problem that we are facing on the low level is not like what other cities are facing, but we can look at the highest level of how to help people, how to use technology in order to do good, what technology to use and what technology not to use. This is one side. The other side, there isn't any database of sharing with other cities except discussion and summits and so on. But we need to look into it, right, John?
Absolutely. We're very open to it. And I think it's one of those things where we know we can learn so much from one another, and nobody's looking to reinvent the wheel here. Let's build on top of the successes that each other has had. I think the challenge is time. The challenge is finding time in the schedule to do all the things that we would like and have all the conversations that we would like to have. So I would say it's an area for us to improve and to do better. And we are absolutely open to it.
That's good to know. We will follow up on that later on. Another question that came for John. You mentioned user experience design, but to what extent are citizens involved in planning your initiatives or policies? Is there any co-designing or deep participation with citizens for tech and policies plans?
So excellent question, Yuki. And I should have mentioned that when I was mentioning collabs and the Accessible Mental Health Challenge. That's not something that we decided to do. That is something that a specific community in New York City asked for. So most recently in Inwood and Washington Heights, which are in northern Manhattan, predominantly Latino, a lot of Dominican immigrants in those areas, we held workshops and engaged and asked the community to come to the table with what problems they wanted to solve. And then we would work with them to co-design solutions and figure out what role technology could play in those solutions, because we're not looking to build tech for tech's sake. We're looking to use technology in ways that solve real problems people face. And the two things that were brought up were, one, accessible mental health for youth in particular. The other was housing rights, tenant rights, making sure that people understood and could use the rights that they have to not be pushed around or in some way exploited by large corporations and others that might have teams of lawyers at their disposal. So those are the two most recent. But prior to that, we've engaged with Brownsville in Brooklyn, which is, when you look at the statistics, the poorest neighborhood in New York City. And so going into communities that are historically under-resourced and too often overlooked, and simply asking people and engaging through a process to understand the needs and then to co-design the solutions is very much something that we care about and really at the core of our collabs program.
Good. Another related question is that it seems like the newly developed data dashboard are very helpful for municipal management. But at the same time, there was, or seems to be at least in New York, a scarcity of public-facing data. Was this intentional decision? Will it change? Hilay, if you want to go first.
No, let John, it's okay.
Sure. So some data should be public and some data should not be. I think we can all agree on that there are certain types of data, personal data, that's easy. But then there's also the question of data that is in draft form, isn't finished, hasn't been vetted, because when government publishes data, we are taking on a responsibility that we believe that to be correct. We believe that to be true. So the level of the error rate that's acceptable in publicly published data is different from what might be acceptable internally. We do have a big focus on open data. New York City has been a leader in the open data movement. And since a law was passed in New York City in 2013, long before a lot of other cities and even countries were that so focused on open data, we've been publishing data, and that's the default. The default is that data should be open. And when you look at our Internet Master Plan, for example, that has produced an incredible amount of data that it just did not exist, data sets that never existed before on where we see gaps, where infrastructure exists, where it's lacking, and that's now all publicly available. So I want to point out the successes and the good work that's been happening in New York City for a long time on that front. I also just want to recognize that the springtime, the early days of the pandemic were a really tough time. And a lot of folks were figuring out how to tackle these problems, how to provide services when suddenly everyone's working remotely, something that had never happened in the history of New York City government before. And so some things that maybe in the future, the next time around, we'll be able to do simply weren't on the table then. And so I want to leave open the possibility that there are things that we could do, types of data that we could make more broadly available the next time around. And I want to point out that a bunch of institutions, or at least initiatives, have been set up to make that more possible, both in terms of opening up government data, but also taking in data from outside partners. The chief analytics officer for the city created the COVID data recovery initiative, and that is accepting data from companies that, in many ways, like the example I gave you of Harvard and Facebook data, looking at how we could actually create pipelines so that can be done in a way that is easier, faster, and potentially something that is shareable. So I want to leave open the opportunity to do things in new ways going forward, but I also just want to point out that I think we've done things pretty well as a city that's been leading the way for a number of years, not just in the past 12 months.
Okay. Hilay, do you want to conclude with a few last words?
Yeah. The Privacy Act in Israel is very important. It's the most important thing about releasing data. So we need to make sure that you cannot cross-reference any data we put out with other data that people might have from other sources in order to find out specific information about someone. So this is the first thing we are doing every time we publish something on our open data portal. The other thing, that every new any new data we release, we will release it to everyone, not a specific company, startup, and so on. So we make sure that if it's available to all. And if they needed some information, including the privacy matters and so on, even government entities cannot get it. They need to approach us in a certain way, and we have a committee that need to approve it and so on. So we are not publishing any information that could eventually be harmful for any of our residents.
All right. I want to be conscious of the time. And first of all, this was thought-provoking and very interesting for me, and I'm assuming for everyone else in this conversation. On behalf of us at the JCRC of New York, I want to thank all the speakers, the two speakers, for sharing their experience and analysis. To all of you who have participated, I hope to see everyone again in our future events. And please feel free to send us any comment or thoughts you have. Everyone has our contact information, so please feel free to be in touch. Thank you so much, and goodbye.